Get out of here, old man. People like you don't belong in a place like this. The sharpness of the waitress's voice sliced through the restaurant like a knife. Forks stopped halfway to mouths, conversations died mid-sentence, and every set of eyes turned toward the doorway where the words had landed. Standing there was a man who looked like life had taken more from him than it had given. His jacket was old and frayed at the sleeves, his shoes worn thin, the kind of man most people walked past without ever really seeing. Yet he stood with quiet dignity, as though insults couldn't shake the ground he walked on. The restaurant itself was buzzing just moments earlier. The clink of silverware, the sizzling sound of food from the open kitchen, the laughter of friends catching up over dinner. It had been alive with warmth and chatter. But now it was silent, every pair of eyes fixed on the scene playing out. The waitress, with her neatly pressed uniform and confident strut, had positioned herself as the gatekeeper of the establishment, and she was making it clear that this man, with his tired clothes and gentle request, wasn't welcome. "I just wanted a coffee," the old man said softly, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of the humiliation that was unfolding. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. His words were simple, almost apologetic, as though he was ashamed of asking for something so small. The waitress rolled her eyes dramatically and crossed her arms. "Sir, this is not the kind of place you can just walk into if you can't afford it. We don't run a shelter here. Our customers come for quality, for class. So unless you're buying a full meal, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Her voice was loud enough for the entire room to hear. She wanted them to hear. She wanted everyone to see her authority, to know she could keep undesirables out. The old man's face stayed calm. His eyes, however, carried something different, something that no one in the room recognized. There was a flicker, the kind of look that only comes from years of experience, from someone who has seen both hardship and triumph. He nodded slowly, almost as if he expected this treatment. It wasn't the first time, and perhaps deep down he knew it wouldn't be the last. But what neither the waitress nor anyone else in that restaurant knew was that this man was not who he appeared to be. His clothes told one story, but his life told another, a story that would unfold in a way no one could have imagined. A couple at the corner booth exchanged uneasy glances, whispering to each other. A family with 2 kids looked down at their food, avoiding the scene, as though ignoring it would make the discomfort vanish. A businessman in a suit smirked, tapping away at his phone, barely paying attention. And yet everyone felt it. The tension, the awkwardness, the sting of injustice that filled the air. People knew the waitress was wrong, but none of them spoke. The man lowered his gaze to the floor, his shoulders slightly hunched, as though carrying the weight of every cruel word ever thrown at him. He whispered, "I understand." Then he slowly turned to walk away, each step echoing in the suddenly too quiet dining room. At the door, something unexpected happened. A young busboy, barely in his teens, stopped wiping a table and rushed toward him. "Sir," he called softly, his voice full of sincerity, "please don't go like this. If you're hungry, I can pay for your coffee." His words were simple, but they cut through the arrogance that had filled the room only moments earlier. The old man stopped, turned his head, and smiled faintly. He placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder, and with that same quiet dignity said, "Thank you, son. But don't worry. I'll take care of it." The boy nodded, not fully understanding what the man meant, but sensing that something larger was happening. The old man gave him a final look, one of gratitude, and then pushed the door open and disappeared into the night. Inside, the waitress let out a laugh, shaking her head. "Did you see that? He probably didn't even have $2 to his name. And he thinks he can just walk in here and sit with paying customers? Some people really don't know their place." She smirked, glancing around as if expecting approval. But instead, the room stayed silent. A few customers shook their heads, others looked away. The arrogance in her voice was clear, and while no one challenged her directly, the uneasiness grew heavier. What none of them realized in that moment was that the poor old man they had just seen walk out wasn't poor at all. He wasn't helpless. In fact, he was one of the wealthiest men in the city, a self-made entrepreneur who had built businesses, invested wisely, and changed lives. For years he had lived humbly, never flaunting his wealth. To most people he looked like nothing more than another tired old man. And that's exactly what the waitress had assumed. But she had just insulted the wrong person, and in less than 30 minutes, her world and the entire restaurant was going to turn upside down. The old man walked out of the restaurant slowly, his steps steady despite the sting of the humiliation he had just faced. To everyone else, it looked like he was retreating, beaten down by the cruelty of the waitress's words. But inside, his mind was calm and sharp. He had been in far tougher battles in life, and this little moment of disrespect was nothing compared to the storms he had already survived. Still, it lit a spark. He had come in asking for nothing more than a coffee, a warm place to sit, but the arrogance he had just witnessed stirred something inside him. He had seen disrespect before, but tonight he wasn't going to let it pass. Outside, he pulled out his phone and made a quiet call. His voice was calm, steady, but there was a power in it that no one inside that restaurant would have guessed. "Yes," he said into the receiver. "Move forward with the paperwork. I've made my decision. I'll meet you at the location in 20 minutes. With that, he ended the call, tucked the phone back into his pocket, and slowly walked down the street as though nothing unusual had happened. Back inside, the waitress laughed as she leaned against the counter. "Did you see that?" she whispered to a coworker, smirking. "He looked like he hadn't showered in weeks. I swear people like that think they can just sit in here like they belong. Not on my watch." The coworker forced a polite smile, but her eyes darted nervously around the room. She hadn't agreed with what had just happened, but she wasn't about to speak up against her colleague in front of a room full of customers. The young busboy, however, couldn't stop replaying the old man's words in his head. "I'll take care of it." What did he mean? He had looked so calm, so sure of himself, even as he was turned away. Most people would have been embarrassed, maybe even angry. But this man had carried himself differently. The boy didn't know why, but he felt like he had just witnessed something far bigger than what it appeared to be. The customers tried to return to their meals, but the atmosphere had shifted. Some whispered quietly, shaking their heads at the waitress's behavior. Others pretended to ignore it altogether, though the discomfort lingered in the air. Nobody realized that in less than half an hour, every single person sitting in that room would be telling the story of what they had just seen. The old man, whose name was Mr. Anderson, wasn't new to being underestimated. In fact, he had built his entire fortune on moments exactly like this. Moments when people assumed he was nobody, when they dismissed him because of how he looked or what they thought he didn't have. Years ago, he had been a young man with nothing but determination, working multiple jobs just to survive. He had been mocked, ignored, even cheated by those who thought they were better than him. But he never gave up. Over the years, he invested in small businesses, one after another, until his empire quietly grew. He never bragged, never flashed his wealth, and never treated people as if they were beneath him. But tonight, after being insulted for no reason other than his appearance, he decided to make a point. As he walked into a nearby office building, his two lawyers were already waiting for him. They greeted him respectfully, holding folders thick with documents. "Mr. Anderson," one of them said, "are you sure you want to proceed with this purchase tonight?" Anderson gave a small smile and nodded. "Yes, that restaurant is going to be mine. And not just because it's a good business investment. Some lessons need to be taught, and I believe tonight is the right time." Back at the restaurant, the clock ticked on. The waitress was busy serving a large table, laughing and chatting as though nothing unusual had happened. But the other staff members couldn't shake the image of the old man leaving. Even the customers seemed more subdued than before. The young busboy kept glancing at the door, almost expecting the man to return, and return he would. But not as the poor old man they thought he was. In less than 30 minutes, the man they had mocked would walk back into that same restaurant, not to ask for coffee, not to beg for service, but to take ownership of the very place where he had been humiliated. And the look on the waitress's face when she realized the truth would be something no one would ever forget. Half an hour later, the door of the restaurant swung open again. At first, no one noticed. The dinner rush had picked up. The clinking of plates and murmurs of conversation filled the air once more. But then silence spread like a ripple across the room, as eyes turned to see the same old man stepping back inside. This time, though, something was different. He wasn't alone. Walking right behind him were two sharply dressed men in suits, their briefcases in hand, their confident steps commanding the kind of respect that instantly quieted a crowd. The waitress spotted him first. She nearly dropped the tray she was carrying when she saw him return. Her eyebrows arched, and her mouth curled into a mocking smirk. "Seriously?" she muttered under her breath, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Didn't I make myself clear the first time? Some people just don't learn." She placed the tray down and started walking toward him, ready to throw him out again. But before she could even open her mouth, one of the suited men stepped forward, pulling out a thick folder from his case. He looked directly at the restaurant manager, who had just walked out from the back office. "Good evening," the lawyer said firmly. "We're here to finalize the purchase agreement. As of today, this restaurant and all of its assets are now under the ownership of Mr. Anderson." The room froze. Customers who were mid-bite stopped chewing. A couple gasped audibly. The manager blinked, stunned, his face turning pale. "Excuse me? What did you just say?" The lawyer calmly repeated. "This establishment has been purchased by Mr. Anderson. The paperwork is complete. The signatures are here, effective immediately. Ownership has changed hands." Every head in the room turned toward the poor old man they had seen earlier. Mr. Anderson stood tall, his eyes steady, his hands folded calmly in front of him. There was no gloating, no smug smile, just quiet authority. The same man who had been humiliated and kicked out 30 minutes earlier was now, suddenly, the boss. The waitress's jaw dropped. She let out a nervous laugh, shaking her head. Wait. You're joking, right, this guy? The same man who walked in here asking for a cheap coffee? You expect me to believe he owns this place?" She turned to the customers, almost desperate for validation. This is some kind of prank. But it wasn't. The lawyers handed the documents to the manager, who flipped through the pages quickly, his hands trembling. The logo of the parent company was stamped on each page. The signatures were official. Everything was real. He looked up at Mr. Anderson with wide eyes, his voice shaky. "It's true. The restaurant is his. He owns it now." The murmur of the crowd swelled. Some people leaned across tables, whispering. Others clapped their hands over their mouths in disbelief. A man at the bar chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I can't believe what I'm seeing," he whispered to no one in particular. The waitress felt her knees weaken. Just an hour ago, she had mocked this man, treated him like dirt, and humiliated him in front of everyone. Now, in the cruelest twist of fate, he had returned, not as a helpless customer begging for coffee, but as the new owner of the very place where she worked. Mr. Anderson finally spoke, his voice calm but powerful. "I came here earlier not looking for trouble. I asked for nothing more than a cup of coffee. Instead, I was insulted, judged, and thrown out because of how I looked. That should never happen to anyone." His eyes moved across the room, locking on the waitress before sweeping over the customers, the staff, and the manager. Respect should not depend on appearance. Respect should be given to every human being who walks through these doors. The room was dead silent, hanging on to every word. Even the sizzling from the kitchen seemed to fade into the background. Customers stared at him with newfound admiration. The young busboy, the same one who had offered to pay for his coffee, stood in the corner, his mouth slightly open in awe. Mr. Anderson then turned back to the manager. "As of tonight, things are going to change around here. This place will not be known for arrogance or cruelty. It will be known for dignity, for kindness, and for treating people the right way." The waitress swallowed hard, her face pale, her earlier arrogance gone in an instant. She stammered, I didn't mean..." But her voice cracked and she couldn't find the words. Mr. Anderson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth was loud enough without shouting. And with that, the balance of power in the room had completely shifted. 30 minutes earlier, he had been just another old man in shabby clothes. Now he was the owner, the one holding all the cards, the one who had exposed arrogance in its purest form. The customers could sense it too, and the energy in the restaurant buzzed with awe and disbelief. In less than half an hour, the world had turned upside down. The silence that hung over the restaurant was so heavy, it almost felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every customer, every staff member, every set of eyes was locked on Mr. Anderson. Moments ago, they had seen him as nothing more than a poor, unwanted guest. Now they were staring at the man who owned everything around them. The chairs they sat on, the kitchen they ordered from, even the uniforms the staff wore. The manager nervously adjusted his tie, sweat forming on his forehead. He had prided himself on running a tight, successful establishment, but in one unexpected twist, he had been stripped of all authority. The lawyers stood beside Mr. Anderson like pillars of proof, their presence erasing any shred of doubt. The truth was undeniable. This restaurant no longer belonged to him. The waitress, meanwhile, stood frozen. Her earlier confidence, her smug dismissal, her mocking tone, they all came crashing back into her mind like a wave she couldn't escape. The blood drained from her face as her arrogance turned into shame. She tried to force words out, her lips trembling. "Sir, I didn't mean to offend you. I was just following—" But the excuse trailed off. Even she knew it sounded weak. Mr. Anderson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply looked at her with eyes that carried a weight far heavier than anger. Disappointment. And that disappointment hurt far more than any shouted insult ever could. Finally, he broke the silence. "When I walked in here earlier, all I wanted was a coffee. A simple request. But instead of kindness, I was given judgment. Instead of respect, I was given humiliation." His voice was steady, calm, but filled with conviction. That wasn't just about me. It was about the kind of place this restaurant had become. A place where people are treated based on assumptions, not on humanity. The customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some nodded quietly, realizing they had played a role too. They hadn't spoken up. They had sat and watched as an old man was humiliated, and now they were forced to confront that guilt. One woman at the corner table raised her hand hesitantly. "Mr. Anderson," she said softly, I'm ashamed I didn't say anything earlier. You didn't deserve that. None of us should have stayed silent." Her words carried through the room, and others lowered their heads in agreement. The busboy, still standing in the corner, looked down at his shoes, embarrassed that he hadn't done more to help. Mr. Anderson turned to him, but his expression softened. "Son, you did what no one else did. You offered kindness. That's worth more than you know." The boy's eyes lit up, relief washing over him as he realized his small act had not gone unnoticed. The lawyers placed the final signed documents on the counter for the staff to see. It was official, no going back. The manager rubbed his temples, realizing that his reign was over. What happens now?" he asked, his voice breaking. Mr. Anderson didn't hesitate. "What happens now is change. From this day forward, this place will be run differently. No more arrogance. No more prejudice. No more humiliating people because of how they look. Every customer will be treated with the same respect, whether they walk in wearing a suit or wearing rags." The statement drew murmurs of approval from several customers. Some even clapped softly, appreciating the new vision. The waitress, however, felt the walls closing in. She stepped forward, her voice shaking. Please don't fire me. I need this job. I wasn't thinking. I made a mistake." Her eyes were wide, desperation taking over the arrogance that had defined her earlier. Mr. Anderson looked at her for a long moment. The entire restaurant seemed to wait for his judgment. Would he throw her out the way she had thrown him out? Would he take revenge? Finally, he shook his head slowly. "I'm not here to destroy lives, but I am here to make sure lessons are learned. You'll keep your job if you can prove you've learned what respect really means." Her knees buckled slightly in relief, tears forming in her eyes. "Yes, sir. I promise. I'll never treat anyone like that again." It was a humbling moment, not just for her, but for everyone watching. They saw in real time how arrogance could be shattered and replaced by humility. And they saw that true power wasn't about shouting the loudest. It was about leading with fairness. The energy in the restaurant began to shift. What had started as humiliation turned into revelation. Customers whispered to one another, amazed at the transformation they were witnessing. Some even pulled out their phones, discreetly recording the scene, knowing this was the kind of story that would spread far beyond these walls. Mr. Anderson glanced around one more time, letting the weight of the moment settle. "Remember this night," he said, his voice carrying the gravity of truth. "Not because I bought this place, but because we all saw how quickly arrogance can crumble, and how powerful respect can be." And with that, the new chapter of the restaurant had officially begun. The following days were nothing short of extraordinary. Word spread like wildfire about what had happened inside that little restaurant. The poor-looking old man, who turned out to be the new owner, the arrogant waitress brought to tears, and the way the entire staff and customers had been forced to confront their own behavior. It became more than just gossip in town. It became a story people shared everywhere. In coffee shops, in offices, even on social media, where snippets of the confrontation captured on phones began to go viral. Videos of Mr. Anderson standing tall, speaking with calm authority, were replayed thousands of times. People admired the way he never once raised his voice, how he didn't seek revenge, but instead demanded respect and dignity for everyone. Comment after comment praised him. This is what real power looks like. He's teaching lessons money can't buy. We need more leaders like him. The restaurant itself transformed almost overnight. Customers who had once taken the place for granted now walked in with curiosity, eager to see the new direction it was heading. The energy was different. There was warmth in the way staff greeted people, a humility in how they served, and a noticeable change in how everyone, from the cook to the servers, treated customers. It was as though the very air had shifted, replacing arrogance with gratitude. The waitress who had mocked Mr. Anderson on that first day was now quieter, humbler. Every time a new customer walked in, she greeted them with genuine politeness, no matter how they looked or what they ordered. She had become a living example of what happens when arrogance collides with truth. Some customers whispered about her, remembering how she had treated Mr. Anderson. Others noticed how hard she was trying to change, and though the shame of her actions still lingered, she was slowly building herself back up, determined never to repeat the same mistake again. The busboy, too, found himself in the spotlight. Mr. Anderson made sure everyone knew how that young man had offered kindness when no one else did. Respect doesn't depend on wealth, Mr. Anderson told him one evening. It depends on character, and you showed more character than an entire room full of adults. The boy smiled, his confidence blooming. For the first time he felt seen, valued, and inspired. As for Mr. Anderson, he didn't change his appearance. He still walked around in his modest clothes, still carried himself with the same quiet dignity. But now when people saw him, they didn't see a shabby old man. They saw the man who had taught an entire community a lesson in humanity. He wasn't interested in making the restaurant fancy or expensive. Instead, he focused on making it a place where everyone, rich or poor, young or old, could sit, eat, and feel respected. One evening, about a week later, the restaurant was packed. Families were laughing, couples were chatting, and even strangers struck up conversations with one another. There was a warmth that hadn't existed before, and as Mr. Anderson stood at the corner of the room watching it all unfold, he couldn't help but smile. A customer walked up to him and said, "Sir, you could have humiliated that waitress. You could have fired her in front of everyone. Why didn't you?" Mr. Anderson paused for a moment, then replied softly, "Because the goal isn't to break people. It's to open their eyes. If she learned something that changes how she treats others for the rest of her life, then that's far more valuable than revenge." The customer nodded, deeply moved by his words. It was clear now that Mr. Anderson wasn't just running a restaurant. He was building something far more important, a legacy of respect. Months later, the story still lingered in people's minds. Travelers passing through town would stop by the restaurant just to see the place they had read about online. Some even came hoping to catch a glimpse of Mr. Anderson himself, the man whose quiet power had humbled an entire room. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man once treated like he didn't belong had become the reason people wanted to belong. And that transformation, that poetic justice, was the kind of story that people carried with them long after they left. For the staff, the customers, and even the community, the night Mr. Anderson revealed his ownership became a turning point. It wasn't just about a restaurant changing hands. It was about arrogance being stripped away, about humanity being restored, and about one man proving that true respect is the greatest form of wealth anyone can possess. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all was this: you never know who you're looking down on. The person you dismiss, mock, or push aside might be the very one holding the power to change your world. In Mr. Anderson's case, that power didn't come from money alone. It came from wisdom, dignity, and a refusal to let cruelty define him. The old man who once walked in asking for a cup of coffee had walked out owning not just a restaurant, but the respect of everyone who had witnessed the story unfold. And in the end, that was worth more than any fortune.